overwrite control information that is used internally by the control logic of the program. And thus, the program gets to jump to a location that the attacker controls. So that location can, in fact, be part of the input, and that input can contain instructions that are executable in that architecture, and thus the attacker gets to run their own piece of code. Once they manage to do that, they're home free. Basically, they get to compromise that particular process. They run with the same privileges as the process. They can download more code. They can do anything they want. Right? So this is the very basic idea of sort of the first instance, not the first, the most basic instance of a buffer overflow attack. The only reason I mention it here is just to give you an idea of the kind of failures we're talking about here. All right. So what happens is that, in fact, these types of vulnerabilities are found increasingly in modern software. So this is data provided by US CERT, which is an organization that keeps track of vulnerabilities, attacks, and so on and so forth. And they only published this data as of the end of the third quarter of 2004. After that, they got too depressed and stopped publishing it. They said, okay, we're not going to bother with this. So this tracks the number of vulnerabilities of distinct vulnerabilities that were found in different software packages, whether open source or Microsoft and so on. So, they peaked in 2002 at about a little over 4,000 different vulnerabilities. And then they went down a little in 2003, 2004, unclear. Remember, this is up till including third quarter of 2004. Likewise, the number of serious vulnerabilities that were discovered, that again, CERT post an advisory saying, hey, you really need to pay attention, has increased quite a bit since 2000 and shows no signs of coming down. Monitoring the relevant mailing lists also sort of empirical evidence shows that those numbers are still at the same level. And the actual incidents are going up. We don't know about 2004. They stopped publishing. Now, these numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt because there really is no difference from the point of view of counting at CERT between an attack against a bank, a financial institution with 100,000 machines, that's one incident, versus one attack against my laptop. Right? They're fundamentally different types of incidents, but they count them as equivalent incidents. But anyway, that should give you some idea. And what's interesting is that many of these, and in particular many of the problems that are remotely exploitable, are software-based vulnerabilities of the kind that the example that I gave you earlier, stack smashing attacks, buffer overflows, and other variants. So in particular in 2003, 24 or 25, depends how you count them, of the 28 remotely exploitable vulnerabilities were of the particular buffer overflow kind, and then 2004 similar statistics for the first 3 quarters. Interestingly enough, the pace at which these attacks arrive has also increased quite a bit. Symantec compiles a inventory or a report every, I think every half a year, every 6 months, publishing the state of security or incidents as they see them. They have a lot of monitoring posts around the internet and look at incidents and attacks and probes. So they found that on average there were about 10 new vulnerabilities disclosed publicly per day in the first half of 2005. And there were 7 a day in 2004, just for comparison. The average time it took for an attacker to create an exploit that took advantage of a particular vulnerability was 6 days after a vulnerability was announced. So a vulnerability could have been announced by Microsoft saying, hey, we've released a new security update, so please download it. And on average, within 6 days of that, an attack would appear that would have reverse engineered the patch and created a script that anybody could run and compromise machines that weren't in fact patched. Now, I keep beating on Microsoft, but open source software is in the same sort of boat. It's not appreciably better. And again, 2004 similar numbers, 5.8 days. Interesting sort of outliers in this space. The witty worm, which appeared middle of 2004, I think, appeared less than 48 hours before the vulnerability announced. The way some people counted it was less than 24 hours, in fact. And my doom may have been the first 0-day worm. That is a worm that appeared without any warning whatsoever. We didn't even know there was a vulnerability in a particular piece of software. There was no patch out that Microsoft had posted that people could, in principle, download, but instead the worm appeared, and that was the first warning we got that that piece of software was vulnerable. So clearly, there's very little you can do to react to such a problem, at least with traditional methods of waiting for Microsoft to post a patch. So what are the countermeasures? I'll go over them. Take this very quickly. Take this very simple model of a network. You have an attacker on the upper side and a defender on the lower side. So there are various places in this simple model where different kinds of defenses may be placed, and I basically categorize them in 5 different spaces. The first is beat on the software vendors to produce better software, right? So this is, okay, let's step out of the box. Let's go to the people that create the buggy software that we run and get them to train their programmers or to use better tools or better testing techniques, whatever it is, better quality control, and give us better software. That works to some extent. Microsoft, for example, has gone through quite a bit of effort to train the programmers, but we still have problems, and we know that that can only go so far. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's one approach within the space of solutions. Another approach is network-based protection. So we put firewalls, whether inside the core of the network operated by ISPs or near the defending side, where we do things like filtering or signature-based filtering or anomaly detection, things like that. So these work to some extent. They work against some types of attacks, not very well against things that exploit software specifically, and certainly not very well against, at least so far, against attacks that that we haven't seen before. They may work reasonably well if once we have a signature of an attack. We then may have a host-based protection, that is things that we push on the software, and these may include things like hardware facilities, like the no-execute bit on some of the recent Athlons and Opterons, or I forget what they're called, the 64-bit architecture from AMD and Intel. Although even those, there was recently a paper that showed how those can be bypassed. So no panacea. Things like managed code, where the code operates under the auspices of some kind of security policy, and we monitor that. We've defined that security policy in terms of the interaction of that code with the rest of the machine. So that might not prevent the process from being compromised, but at least it prevents it from prevents an attacker from compromising the rest of the machine. Or things like compartmentalization. You run your web server in one virtual machine, your web browser in another virtual machine, and so on. Again, same idea. Somebody breaks in, at least they can't compromise the rest of the machine. We may have containment, which is in some sense, the logical complement of network-based protection, which is try to push the protection near the attacker. And the idea here is that when somebody attacks a machine, they take it over and then they use it as a springboard to attack other systems. So if we can detect that the machine has been compromised, perhaps as it's been compromised or because of its behavior after it has been compromised, for example, outgoing TCP connections from a web server, there really isn't any good reason why that should be happening. So then we can use containment or quarantining to isolate that machine from the network until the administrator has a chance to come around and fix it. And this is one of the approaches that Cisco's self-healing networks, or whatever it's called these days, that's one of the mechanisms that's used there. And finally, we can have software-based protection, which means now go into the particular software that's running on the machine, and rather than build things around it, go inside it and put barriers and protective measures inside it. So there are many different kinds of mechanisms that offer different trade-offs in terms of performance, a need to access the source code, and effectiveness in stopping the attack and perhaps maintaining the service availability. And depending on what you want to do, you use one or the other. So there are mechanisms that are very lightweight in terms